Okay, folks, it is actually 6:02. That clock is a little slow in the back of the room, so we're going to begin.
Recording in progress.
If counselors and others could take their seats. Good evening. This is a special meeting of the Zoning and Planning Committee where we have reached out to encourage the entire council to join us for a special presentation and briefing on the Village Center Overlay District in advance of the public hearing, which is scheduled for next Monday evening. So I need to read the items into the record, and then we will begin the presentation. Item 38-22 is the Zoning and Planning Committee requesting review, discussion, and amendments relative to Chapter 30 zoning ordinances and adding a new Village Center Overlay District consisting of 4 district tiers by establishing requirements for such district and requesting amendments to the zoning map to include the Village Center Overlay District. And item 39-22, which we discuss in concert because, as we know, sometime after we began the Village Center zoning work, about a year later, the state passed the MBTA Communities Act, so 39-22 is requesting a discussion on state guidance for implementing what is known as the Housing Choice Bill, and we know it as the MBTA Communities Law, because that's the piece of that act that impacts our work. So I'd like to introduce who's in the room and who's online. First, from the committee. So I'm Deb Crossley, chair of the committee and at-large counselor from Ward 5. I'm joined at the beginning of the meeting in the room by President Susan Albright, who was behind me. Oh, there she is. At-large from Ward 2, Councilor Pam Wright, at-large from Ward 3, Councilor Holly Ryan, ward councilor from Ward 8, and then there are other counselors in the room, but I'm going to introduce those on the committee who are online. I believe Councilor Krinsman, at large from Ward 4, has joined us, and Councilor Lyle Baker, ward councilor from Ward 7, has joined us. I think that's it at the start of the meeting for the committee. We also have in the room Councilor Julia Maliki and Councilor John Oliver from the City Council. Many other councilors online. Let's see if I can do this. Councilor Andrea Kelly, Chris Markowitz, Maria Scabelli Greenberg. I can't scroll, you know. Councilor Lenny Gentile, Councilor, okay, stop moving it. And I think that's it at the beginning of the meeting. So I know folks might be trickling in as we move forward. We have the pleasure of having the entire team here this evening, consisting of both the City Planning and Development Department staff for long-range planning, Director Barney Heath, Associate Director Jennifer Kyra, and Chief of Long-Range Planning Zachary Lamel. And then we have 4 members, oh boy, we also have our newer person here who is Joseph Ian Donacy. I bet you can't spell it, who's our new planning associate. Thank you. And we have 3 members from our consultant team, UTEAL. We have Timothy Love. We have Lauren Rapport. And we have Will Cohen, all joining us this evening. They have a brief presentation or briefing overview specifically for the council, and particularly councilors who haven't been able as yet to join us. It will be recorded, as always, and available online. I see we've been joined by more counselors. Counselor Becky Grossman, at large from Ward 7, has joined us. I can't keep doing that all the way through the evening, but as people trickle in, hopefully, and a full complement of zoning and planning committee members has now just arrived in the person of Councillor Allison Leary at large from Ward 1. Okay. We are also joined by members of the Planning and Development Board, and our protocol is to ask them to introduce themselves. They've been following us very closely, coming to most of our meetings. Chair Kelly Brown, would you like to introduce your committee?
Sure. We have with us Peter Doringer, Lee Breckenridge. I'm having the same scrolling difficulties. That's, if somebody else is on the board, they can introduce themselves, but that's the folks that I see. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So, without further ado, I believe Director Heath is going to open the meeting, followed by Mr. Lamel, and then they have a lineup prepared in order to give their presentation. Thank you.
Good evening, honorable councilors. We appreciate your time and attention this evening so that we may share with you where we are with the proposed Village Center overlay zoning and where we are with the development of the MBTA compliant zoning that Newton is required to have in place by the end of the year as part of the MBTA Communities Law. The proposal you will see tonight is the product of 2 years' worth of community engagement, extensive work with the members of the Zoning and Planning Committee, and the combined efforts of the planning staff and UTIL to develop Village Center zoning, which concentrates housing capacity, which as a city we see as desirable, and now, by virtue of the MBTA Communities Law, are required to have, right where you would logically want it to be located, in the commercial heart of our village centers, representing just 3% of Newton's entire land area, and notably where it is best accommodated near available transit and services, conducive to our urgent efforts to reduce our carbon footprint, and where an increased customer base would stand to greatly benefit village center businesses. That said, you will see this evening that careful attention has been paid to calibrate the details of the physical form that future development would take by prescribing specific design standards. Now I'd like to turn things over to our Chief of Long Range Planning, Zach Lamel, to take you through the proposed zoning details.
Hi, everybody. Some quick Zoom technical issues, and then we'll dive in. What's up? Wonderful. Thanks, Barney. So just really quickly, I want to lay out a roadmap for tonight's presentation. We're going to touch upon, why we undertook this effort and what we're looking to accomplish. We'll turn it over to the UTIL team, where they'll get into the proposal itself and how it functions. We're going to highlight how this proposal aligns with our MBTA community's requirements, and then we'll round things out with some expected outcomes and how those outcomes really align with the community vision that grew out of our extensive outreach. And we'll close things with Chair Crossley laying out next steps when it comes to the upcoming public hearing and looking forward to a vote before the end of the year. Next slide. So, As Barney mentioned here, our village centers are our live, work, and play hubs. We are really, really lucky that we have them as our starting point. They're incredible places, and not every place has them, so that's really good. And we undertook this effort because we know that things can and should be better. Next slide. We've been facing some challenges, and we heard about those challenges throughout our outreach. A lack of housing options, struggling local businesses, climate change, a big one, transportation and traffic issues, aging in place, welcoming new families, and looking for spaces to gather and socialize. And when you look at successful village centers, these places are where the solutions lie. And new development going forward, is going to play a major role in tackling these challenges. And development is controlled by our zoning code. And these rules for our village centers have been in place for about 40 years now. And it's just not working. And not only is it not working, it's really further contributing to these challenges and issues we face. Next slide. So there's a lot of things, a lot of details within our zoning rules. I just want to focus on 3 ones here. It takes a Herculean effort to build anything, particularly multifamily housing, whether it be parking requirements, height restrictions, setbacks, FAR, the fact that anything over 2 units requires a special permit. It basically is impossible to take a small piece of property and build housing. The rules instead are unpredictable. They lead to the aggregation of many, many pieces of property, and it leads to large development that's more expensive and takes more time. Next slide. Second, if you're looking to open a small business or expand an existing successful one, you're met with a barrage of zoning red tape. These are the spaces that are bringing people to the village centers. We go to our village centers to take a yoga class. We take our kids to the doctor's office. We meet friends for a coffee. We're going out to get shoes, whatever that may be. And then afterwards, we're getting lunch or we're getting dinner. These are the spaces that are giving the vibrancy to our village centers, and we need to make it as easy as possible for entrepreneurs to call Newton home. Next slide. And finally, we'll talk about parking requirements. We've been working a lot on this, but really what we found through this effort, it's the tail that wags the dog. If we're looking at quality design, if we want better buildings, if we want better streetscapes, if we want open spaces to gather and have concerts in, we really need to seriously look at parking. Next slide. And that's what's bringing us all here tonight, right? It's our village center proposal, which is building off these 2 years of work that we've done, and it can help us address these challenges. It's going to offer housing opportunity. It's going to provide opportunity for commercial spaces, places to shop. It's going to ensure that new development has quality design. It has a human scale to it. It's going to help create and build upon that sense of place that businesses are looking to succeed. It's going to make sure it's safe for bicyclists, pedestrians, and drivers. And it's going to address our climate change needs, right? The electrification ordinance is one big thing that's going forward. All new development is going to have to be fossil fuel free. And so I think the vision that's set out in place is really critical here. And when we get into the details, which I'm going to turn it over to you, Teal, in a second, this is what we're striving towards.
Just get the microphone to a convenient height here. Hi, my name is Tim Love. I'm a principal of UTEAL, and I've been involved with the planning department in this initiative for the past 2 years. And I'm going to explain briefly the basics of the zoning code itself. Oh, okay. Next, please. Thanks. Go ahead. First, we, in thinking about the zoning code as an overlay, we wanted the rules of the code to be as simple and transparent to the widest number of people as possible. And that includes developers and architects, it includes homeowners, it includes land use attorneys and people who are generally interested in development that might be coming to their neighborhood. And so the rule set is predicated on a very simple idea, which is that for each of the tiers in the village center zoning, we have a series of maximum building footprint sizes, which is the square foot of the building as it meets the ground. That sets the size of a building in a very direct way. The next rule set is the number of stories that you're allowed to have. In this particular example, we're showing you the second tier of the zoning, Village Center 2, which is 3.5 stories. And finally, in all of the zones, we include this thing called the half story, which is not literally a half story, but it's a requirement in the 4 tiers that you either have to have a pitch roof, or in the 2 bigger zones, you can have a setback penthouse, setback 7 feet on all sides, to give some profile to the shape of a building. So you can't just have a building with a flat top. So those are the basics of the code. So for any of the tiers we're proposing, you look at the maximum footprint, you look at the number of stories, and you follow the roof form rules. That, we think, is easier to understand than a more abstract mathematical formula like FAR. Next, please. And in terms of the tiers themselves, with some back and forth and very good feedback from ZAP, we've landed on a recommendation of 4 tiers. And the way they're organized is from the lowest density to the highest density, or vice versa. I'll start with the biggest building that you can build in the framework, which is what we call VC3. In the VC3 district, you can't build a building any bigger than a 15,000 square foot floor plate. You can't build taller than 4.5 stories. We've also, for different classifications of uses, sent a maximum building height. And so you see on the lower left a depiction of what that scale of building would look like. The next tier down, VC2, it's a story shorter. It's 3.5 stories. It's a 10,000 square foot floor plate instead of 15,000 square feet. And you can see that the maximum number of feet is also lower. And then in a very small area, I'll show you on a map in a minute, there's VC1. It's a 4,000 square foot floor plate, 2.5 stories. And then what we call the MRT district, which is also 2.5 stories, but allows a footprint of only 1,500 square feet. And you can see in the drawings the different scales of buildings that would result from that rule set, but also different ways that the roof form rule has been applied for the different scales of buildings. Next. As for where the overlay is proposed, you can see it on the map. This represents 3.4% of the total land area of Newton. It's in alignment in some cases with the MBTA community's housing choice law that Will's going to talk about in a minute. But to explain the color coding of the map, the VC3 zones are the bright red, which might be a little bit hard to see on the map, but hopefully you can. VC2 is the dark blue, relatively small areas. VC1 is only along Route 9, the purple color along Route 9 on either side of Newton Highlands and near the Elliott T-stop. And then the MRT is the green, which is limited around some village centers and a little bit more extensive in others based on looking at the existing neighborhoods and other kinds of kind of qualitative issues. So that's the application of those 4 tiers of the overlay across the citywide. Next, please. What's important about the zoning beyond the basics of the urban form, which is footprint, number of stories, and roof form, we've also baked into the zoning design guidelines themselves through a series of dimensional design standards that are meant to result in good design outcomes. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but they include requirements for active ground floor uses. They, in terms of the percentage of fenestration that you have, it means that you can use canopies, bays, and porches beyond the footprint limitation, as long as it's within the setbacks, to encourage builders and developers to put those features on buildings. Other kinds of things like that are built into the zoning itself to not require separate design guidelines, but have them, again, integral with the zoning, with an eye on the quality of the design of the outcome. Next. As part of the process over the last year or so, we've been doing visualizations to test different versions of the design standards through before and after illustrations. This is a particular site on Walnut Street in Newtonville, an existing one-story structure. Next. Next slide. And then applying the design standards rigorously, the kind of building that you would get. You'll see requirements for the shop front on the ground floor, what the consequences of the roof form would be following those rules, logics about setbacks, and not visible in this illustration are additional setbacks requirements where these tiers meet our districts, built into the zoning as well, a kind of contextual, a smart contextual zoning code. Next. We've also, thinking through the zoning code, identified in the zoning map those places where new development has to have active ground floor uses. It's where the black lines are shown in this particular example, which is Newton Center. Outside of the location where the black line is, it's really would be up to the developer to decide if they wanted active ground floor uses or not. But we decided as a committee that it was important to preserve those kind of active centers of the village centers, again built into the zoning code to preserve the active life that already happens in most of them. Next. The other thing that we've done through the process, partly through requests of more analysis and more work by ZAP, has been to look at the resulting quality of street spaces that would result through the future build out of these different tiers of village center zoning. And so these are different streets that we've looked at, looking at VC3 and the consequences of the proportions of the street section and the qualities of that street space as a consequence of the scale of building that we're talking about. And this was referenced back to street proportions of spaces in earlier conversations we've had with some of you about other streets that we know and like in Newton and nearby communities. Next. I'm going to turn it back over to Zach now to talk about where this fits into the legacy of the city.
Thanks, Tim. So now that we know a little bit more detail about the proposal, how it works, what we can expect, I just want to take another second to ground the proposal. What this would allow, what the Village Center would allow, is in complete alignment with Newton's historical development patterns. I think as you can see here, really every single village center, there is or there have been buildings of these sizes and these scales going back 150 plus years. Next slide. And while some of those buildings I just showed predate Newton zoning from the 1920s, not all of them do. And that's also because historically Newton zoning allowed for these taller buildings. Between the 1920s and the 1950s, Newton allowed within and around its village centers buildings that were 80 feet tall and 6 stories by right. Okay? In the 1950s, this was changed to 60 feet and 6 stories. And it wasn't until the 1980s, until 1987, that the zoning code was changed to what it is today of 2 stories maximum and 24 feet by right. So our current zoning proposal is right in line with what has been built and what has been allowed to be built for longer than our current rules are right now. Next slide. And just really quickly, actually, go back one. Sorry about that. I just want to stick on this because I think out there right now, there's a lot of people speaking about the zoning proposal, which is wonderful, right? We want everyone to be informed and come to the public hearing on Monday. But what you may be hearing something along the lines of the Village Center proposal is revolutionary for Newton. And really anyone who is saying that just does not know their history, period. This work fits right in line with what Newton has been and what Newton is. So next slide. Just want to focus on two other points of the code before I turn it back over to you, Teal. Really when it comes to ensuring quality design and creating more affordable housing. Parking is allowed, but not required. This is going to help with our streetscape and pedestrian experience. It's going to help with our environmental concerns. We are fully aware that people will and should provide parking. The market will decide. But we know right now that half of all parking provided in our multifamily housing sits empty. And that's really expensive. An underground parking spot requires about $100,000 to build. And anything that we can do to reduce the cost of construction is going to lead us to number two. Next slide. Allowing for and creating more affordable housing. So we all know, I think in this room, but anyone listening online, we have an inclusionary zoning ordinance that requires 7 or more unit projects to have a certain percentage of affordable housing, 17.5%. That will be in place. The Village Center zoning encourages more multifamily housing, so we will see more affordable housing. In addition, there is a bonus option. It can be used in very specific circumstances, really only in the core of our village centers in the VC3 and VC2 zones, as Tim was talking about. And it allows for 25% to 30% requirement of those units to be affordable. So, we're getting to almost double what our base conditions require. And I know here that there's a couple different policy objectives at play, right? We, of course, want more affordable housing, but we also want to make sure that we are protecting and transitioning smoothly from the village centers to the surrounding neighborhoods. There are protections in the code. Happy to talk in more detail about them later. There's step back down requirements. There's setback requirements. In some cases, you just can't take advantage of the bonus. So again, we are making sure we are providing opportunities for affordable housing, but also making sure the transition down to those residential neighborhoods happens smoothly. With that, I will turn it over to you, Teal, to talk about MBTA communities.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. My name is Will Cohen. I'm an urban planner at UTL. I've been working with the planning team on this project for a couple of years now. Next slide, please. So, as has been alluded to a couple different times, this project has been concurrent with perhaps a little bit a prediction of, but is now parallel to and in partnership with attempts to find compliance with the MBTA Communities Housing Choice Law. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. There's a lot of discussion that's been going around both in Newton and in the greater Boston area. Oh, that's great. Thank you. I will try to stop looking away from the mic now. There's been a lot of discussion around the MBTA communities legislation, and I think some misconceptions that would be useful for us to clear up as we go forward. Next slide, please. Okay, so in this law, as was passed, is 3 paragraphs. It's a new chapter, or it's a new section of Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 40A, which is the Zoning Act. So this is, a modification to the enabling legislation that allows communities, with the exception of the city of Boston, to regulate land use in their communities. This is a change to thinking about how cities, the responsibilities that cities have when undertaking that responsibility. And the second bullet point on this slide is really the point. It requires communities that have access to or adjacent to the MBTA to have at least one zoning district which permits multifamily development as of right. That's really all it does. It requires that a new district be created that meets a set of guidelines. It does not require that new housing be built. It does not require that property owners sell property under some given circumstance. It doesn't do anything about eminent domain. It simply expects that communities create compliant zoning districts. It is a tool to try to deal with the housing crisis. There are many things that Zach and the full planning staff has and will be talking about as far as hurdles to housing construction and all the different reasons that the housing crisis exists. One of those is the difficulty in getting projects permitted through zoning. And so this law is an attempt to deal with one of those pieces. To mix metaphors a little bit, since we're talking about housing, you could think of this as a down payment, so to speak, on the mortgage of the housing crisis, right? This is a tool that gets some progress done, but will not in and of itself solve everything. But we do still think it's a critical step. One last thing which is important here is the final bullet. While the zoning district has to allow housing production by right, that does not mean that a housing developer or any potential prospective developer has complete say over what happens. That is not true at all. There is a very powerful tool that the city of Newton would very much retain through this process. That's called site plan review. It's not the same as a special permit. Site plan review allows, as you can see here, a number of things that are established as parameters based on case law. Right? It allows the city to regulate things like vehicular access or circulation or architectural design of a building beyond just the pitched roofs that you see in the zoning code, but other kinds of more detailed aspects of it. The main catch is that site plan review can't be what's thought of as conditional. It can't be a way to think about a special permit under a different name. If a prospective developer is meeting all the rules and is doing all the things right, and there's a reasonable path forward to be able to build the project, site plan review cannot be used to just stop it for some sort of amorphous reason. So in that sense, it is not the same as a special permit. But it is still a critical tool that provides a lot of authority to the city to make sure the housing or the development is happening in a way that's appropriate and good for the community. Next slide, please. One other thing to keep in mind is Newton is a very special place, but you are not alone in this. Right? There are 175 plus other communities all grappling with this same problem under a similar timeline. Some communities have to do this by the end of this year, if you have rapid transit, and everyone else has to get this done by the end of next year. So all 175 plus communities are all trying to do or the state is asking that all the communities do their part, do their fair share to address some aspect of the housing crisis. In some sense, this should be reassuring. One, you're not alone. But also more importantly, the worries that some change will cause some tidal wave of development or pressure or other kinds of market instances to Newton and Newton alone is I think very much mitigated by the fact that this is a broader regional change. This is a statewide attempt to sort of address some reverse tragedy of commons effect here, so that now this kind of housing makes more sense regionally, across municipal borders. That story that Zach was just talking about a moment before about the progressive downzoning by right of buildings, from 8 to 6 to 2 stories, that's also not a Newton-specific phenomenon. That happened across almost every one of these municipalities over the 20th century. And so it's important that that be dealt with systematically and at the state level or at the local level through state action, which is sort of where we are today. One thing that is important to note is as a community that's close to that's in the inner core, that's abutting the city of Boston, and as one with a fairly high population relative to Eastern Massachusetts, it is true that the burden or that the expected unit capacity of Newton is higher than other communities. However, as I think Tim was trying to explain, and as we'll get into a little bit more, we do believe that we're hitting the compliance target in a way that is contextual and is appropriate for the community and isn't overly burdensome. Next slide, please. All right, so part of why we've been retained by the city and part of why we've been working on this project for years now is this is an extremely complicated planning problem to tackle. And the way that the state has worked on this is they've created a set of, sorry, let me take a step back. So the law itself has about 3 paragraphs. It's not remarkably detailed in terms of how this housing crisis solution be met, but it has tasked the agency formerly known as DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, to come up with a set of guidelines to help municipalities achieve compliance in a way that is appropriate to the state or that is acceptable by the state. And so in trying to do so, the state has to figure out how to determine compliance for 175 communities with vastly different levels of density, form, character, history, and all kinds of other issues. So there's a fairly complicated set of guidelines, rules, different ways that amounts of housing are calculated for different kinds of municipalities, and they were predetermined by the state, and those are the parameters that we've all been set out with trying to figure out in terms of a new district. And so there's a couple rules that apply to everyone. One is that you have to have, many different sub-pieces of the district, but at least one of them has to be big. It can't just be little islands of zoning all across the city. One of them has to be 50% of the zoning district. They have to be of a certain kind of size. There's rules about density, but the main things that matter the most are that the gross density, if you look at the entire district across the board, you have to allow, or at least permit from an as-of-right perspective, 15 units an acre. That doesn't mean 15 units per acre of new construction. It means if nothing were on any of the buildings or any of the sites, if all the buildings were instantly wiped away from the city of Newton, not something we wish to see happen, and new things were built from scratch, by right, a developer on a particular parcel could potentially build something at 15 units an acre. And that has to be possible in an aggregate sense across all of it. Some parts can be higher, some parts can be less high. The other key piece is there are restrictions on what you can and cannot say needs to happen in the district. The law talks about housing. It does not talk about other things like commercial. Now, as we've seen earlier in the presentation, it is critical that the city of Newton have robust commercial areas in the center of the village districts. We all agree with this. This is something which the planning team agrees with, the consultant, and frankly, every community that our planning group, that are as a planning firm, because we're working with other communities on this. Every municipality that we've talked to about MBTA communities legislation agrees that the omission of an allowance about commercial ground floor is something problematic about the law. However, there is a solution to this, which is that we simply can't talk about areas where we want to require commercial in the thing we provide to the state. So all those areas that had the black line that Tim was talking about are absolutely a part of Newton's approach to rezoning the districts. Just from a pure technical procedural standpoint, those little pieces don't count towards compliance with the law, which is totally okay. And the last piece is that we can't have rules about age restrictions or the kinds of people that are going to be living in the units. That's both an issue with fair housing and also an attempt to not only meet compliance through things like senior housing development or other kinds of restrictions there. The last thing is that all that yields what the state comes up with as a number of 8330. This is the number that the state says is the target for the zoning district, that Newton has to create a district that allows by right 8330 units. To be very clear here, this does not mean that the city of Newton expects 8,000 units to be built as a result of this district. That number is wholly artificial. It's, as I was saying before, if every building on every parcel in these districts were completely eliminated and all of those buildings and all of those pieces of land were built out to absolute absolute maximum potential through the zoning district everywhere, that could yield 8,000 something units. That is a wholly different number than anything we're talking about in terms of political or planning reality. Another way to think about this might be that there are opportunities where levels of development at the degrees that we've seen in some of these renderings becomes more possible in targeted ways on certain parcels where we expect to see development happen. And there's one fewer constraints towards seeing multifamily development in the city. Next slide. Okay, so here is how the zoning district breaks out into the different village centers for the purposes of this compliance. So again, these numbers do not mean that this many units are coming to any one of the village centers. It simply means that from a pure blank slate as of right development scenario, one not grounded in reality, for the purpose of compliance, this is where we see these numbers. One key thing to note is that that MRT district, the one you see in green, very much connects Newton Center and Newton Highlands. Part of the role of that district was to achieve that level of 50% of this entire zoning district being in one contiguous shape. But besides from that, all the other zones that we're looking at, the VC1, 2, 3, and that MRT, the fact that you see so many of them happening in so many different ways are an attempt by the planning team and the city to provide the level of nuance and contextual character needed to ensure that whatever new development happens, it always is very much in line with what we see in the districts right now and what we want to see as a community. Next slide. So finally, as we've done the calculations, this hasn't been submitted to the state yet. We're still working on finalizing a couple things here and there, but we are confident that this district as defined does meet the compliance requirements of MBTA communities. It has the right number of units. It has the right level of density across the district. It's big enough. There's rules about being near or what percentage of the district has to be within approximate area of different T stops or commuter rail stops versus what can be out. All those are met. But as you can see in the notes, there are other parts of this that matter. We only looked at lots that were smaller than 30,000 square feet, right? That makes a lot of sense, actually. The way that we're talking about by right zoning means we only want to be looking at parts of the city of Newton where it's acceptable to have a little bit less oversight about potential developments. Bigger lots, places where where more housing development could possibly happen, are also precisely the areas where the special permit process makes sense for the city, which caused the district to be more focused on smaller parcel size areas of the city. And then most importantly, this assumes no minimum parking requirements, right? That does not mean that no parking gets built. That definitely does not mean that no parking gets built. Developers have the ability to build parking as they see fit. However, for the purposes of compliance and simplifying zoning and reducing the amount of necessary and underutilized parking, the zoning does not require parking to be built. That allows the compliance numbers to get higher. If parking is required for every single potential project, that, for all the reasons mentioned earlier, dramatically shrinks the amount of housing that zoning in this as-of-right kind of scenario sees potentially happening. So just to keep in mind, while the zoning, as we're talking about it, hypothetically talks about a really high number of units as of right and requires no parking, it is extremely unlikely, in fact, I would say borderline impossible to imagine a scenario where that number is reached in any substantial way or no parking gets built. These are zoning rules to help create a better form for our community. Next slide. I'm going to pass it off to Jen Kara now.
Thank you, Will. Go to the next one. So it's critical that we fulfill our obligations under state law, as Will just explained. However, this effort is and always has been about what's best for Newton and the future of its village centers. This proposal creates new housing opportunities at sizes and price points that just can't be built today. This provides options for older adults looking to downsize or looking for one-story living with an elevator. Provides options for young adults who want to live in the community where they were raised. Provides options for new families to move into Newton and raise their children that can't afford the increasingly expensive single-family homes we're seeing today. In addition to smaller and less expensive housing, it also creates, as Zach described earlier, fully affordable, deed-restricted housing through our inclusionary zoning or our bonus. New development also brings fully accessible housing as well, which is also greatly needed in the city. And thanks to changes in the building code, as well as the electrification ordinance, new buildings will be incredibly energy efficient. More people living in and near village centers is also good for business. This provides an increased customer base. We've also reduced some of the zoning requirements that have been hurdles to new businesses that make it difficult to open, difficult for buildings to adapt or expand as they need and as the market demands. Greater height allowances for the first floor also ensure that new spaces will be bright and airy and attractive for new retail and restaurant. Wider sidewalks are required, which makes it a nicer place to walk and visit multiple businesses, also provides more space for things like outdoor dining. And the city is prepared for these additional residents that may come as part of this zoning. As we've said, growth will be incremental, and it will be focused in areas where we know we have the infrastructure to support it, where there is water and sewer and roads, and importantly, transit. Locating new housing near transit and in walkable areas reduces the number of vehicle trips, reduces congestion. If we don't allow people to live in places like Newton and along the T, they're moving further and further away, traveling further and further to get to jobs, to visit family, to go to other attractions, and are driving through Newton, adding to the congestion on roads. We hope that this housing provides new opportunities for families to locate in Newton. Though we've also seen from recent multifamily developments that there have not been that many school-age children living there, certainly nothing more than the school system can handle. We also know we have years, typically, from permitting to when people are actually living in a new building that allows us to continue to coordinate with the school department as well as any other city departments and services. And finally, new multifamily and mixed-use development has proven to have a net positive fiscal impact on the city. So we didn't get here alone. This effort is the result of over 2+ years of discussions with the community and with the City Council. It builds upon decades of city plans and policies going back to the 2007 Comprehensive Plan and the 2011 Zoning Reform Report. And throughout this, we've tried to reach out to as many people as we can to talk about how they use village centers and what they want to see out of them. As part of this, we have engaged in various ways with over 60 formal community groups across the city, whether it was attending meetings, sharing information, going to high school classes, tabling at events, anything we could in order to hear more voices. Next slide. And this was a 4-phase process to get to where we are today. The first phase was visioning. We wanted to know what people wanted to see for village centers, how they use them today, and what they wanted out of village centers. We got hundreds of really creative, thoughtful, interesting ideas from community members. We had participants in an online interactive survey, focus groups, coordinated with the Economic Development Commission to engage businesses. We stopped people all over the city in busy areas to get them to take a survey and engage. From these visions that we received, we workshopped that into an actual zoning framework by working closely with the Zoning and Planning Committee to create that framework. As part of this, we set up an exhibit for 6 weeks at the library. We solicited feedback through an online tool. We held more focus groups, and we engaged 90 community members to be part of a network that would help us spread the word by talking to their friends, neighbors, coworkers, church groups, schools, etc., about what we were doing and getting more people involved. From there, we worked on turning all of that feedback and framework into an actual ordinance and a zoning map. This first version, we Once we released it, we sent out notices to all the property owners in the boundary, and we held a series of information sessions to solicit feedback that were focused village center by village center. The Zoning and Planning Committee also opened up 2 of the January meetings to community groups to allow them to speak and provide feedback on the proposal thus far. And since then, we've been working on further refining that zoning proposal, refining the maps, working on coming into compliance with MBTA communities, and tweaking the zoning as we have further discussions with the Zoning and Planning Committee. In advance of next Monday's public hearing, we've also sent notices to property owners and occupants within the boundary and abutters to abutters, over 6,000 postcards in total, and put out the word any other way we could. Our newsletter, the mayor's newsletter, emails of everyone who's shared their contact with us over the last 2+ years. And throughout all of this, we've been testing and workshopping this internally with other city departments, the law department, inspectional services, going to other boards and commissions, and most importantly, really working closely with the Zoning and Planning Committee and other counselors through 40 meetings so far that have focused on this village center zoning to test things, further analyze things, poke holes, and further refine to make sure that the final product really is accomplishing our goals. So we're really excited to have reached this point in the process. We look forward to further conversations and refinement over the next few months, as well as any questions or comments tonight. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Chair Crosley to talk about the next steps.
Thank you all for all of your lengthy work, and this was a challenging proposal to describe in 40 minutes. The very next step is for us to hear now from members of the full council. I see that we've been joined early in the presentation by Councilors Lipoff, Kalis, and Noel, and Councilor Downs. What my intent is to favor counselors who are not on the committee. If they were to raise their hand first, I would go there. We've been deliberating this zoning for 2 years plus, and taking it apart, putting it back together again, taking it apart and putting it back together again. The committee recently decided that it's ready for prime time and set the public hearing, which is our formal announcement to the City Council that we want now everyone to weigh in. The public hearing is next Monday night starting at 7, and the summer, at least the month of July, the committee will be meeting at least a couple of times to continue the decisions that need to be made, the refinements that we talked about. And we will leave the public hearing open and continue it in September. I see that Councilor Kalis already had his hand up, so let's just dig in.
Thank you so much, Councilor Crossley. This was a great presentation. I really appreciate it. Great work. So I have a bunch of questions, and you can just shut me off when you need to. So I'm just wondering, there's a couple of small things. Can you explain why there was the step down in height since 1922?
Why that happened?
Yeah. Is there any evidence? Is there any rationale as to why that happened over the years, or was it the mood in the country? Was it something having to do with Newton? Anything that you might have?
Well, I think as Will from UTL was saying, this is a systemic issue that happened across the country. Downzoning happened over time. I can send you 2 or 3 pages from our pattern book that was released in 2018. I think it has a really good overview of what was happening. But the population was doubling every decade at that point. There was a lot of pressure happening very, very quickly. But again, this is something that's not unique to Newton.
Was a lot of it exclusionary zoning as well?
Yeah, I think it was partly in a lot of suburban communities in Greater Boston and across North America, an effort to keep more complicated mixed-use buildings out of the city as a directed policy decision and really favor single-family houses.
Okay, that's helpful.
Right.
Because as you were speaking, I remember reading some books about that, and I must have forgotten it. So can you talk to me about the level of engagement around Newton Highlands? Because when we met a while ago, we had talked about it, and my main gripe was the VC3 all around Lincoln Street and Walnut Street, because they're just one lanes going on each, and I just felt like that was too much. And I look at it compared to Waban and being 3 times the capacity, and I'm just wondering, I might just be out of step with the community. Is the community wants this? That's great, but I'm just wondering what the engagement was and more rationale around that.
Yeah, so part of that rationale is we looked at the size of the village center, the mix of uses, the existing commercial base, and the sort of size and scale of some existing buildings. So Newton Highlands got treated a little differently than Waban in that case, since Waban has a very small sort of commercial area and quickly transitions to single-family homes, whereas Newton Highlands had some of this fabric already of these taller buildings, mixed-use buildings, multifamily housing. We also did some street perspectives, because we did hear that concern from you as well as from some others about what does this look like on the street. If you're on Lincoln Street, what does it look like if you have VC3 buildings? So one of the slides we briefly showed that we presented earlier this year did those perspectives where we were on Lincoln Street. We showed new VC3 development, compared it to the width of the street. Tim may be able to speak a little more on this. There's sort of an ideal ratio of building height to street width where you feel comfortable. And from our analysis and UTL's design, that VC3 fit well in Newton Highlands and in Lincoln Street.
Because that's exactly the point, the comfortability, because there are areas on Walnut and on Lincoln where I think it could fit, but the areas that you have, I'm questioning it.
Can we put the slide back up, please, if you could try to find it, of Newton Highlands Village Center?
I think the other thing is that the half-story requirement, which either requires a pitch of a certain angle or a 7-foot setback, which is justified by that allowing for a 6-foot terrace, which is a nice usable terrace, has to do with the cornice height of the building versus its actual height. That innovation in the zoning, which happened relatively early, was to bring 4 stories down to 3 stories and 5 stories down to perceptually within the street space 4 stories. So that was partly through the testing we've done through digital models and cross sections to get the apparent scale of the buildings down. But these in particular were street sections that we looked at in a couple of the village centers that came up through the engagement to look at the proportions of the street space that resulted. And the general principle for a comfortable street is the proportion of the width of the street to the height is a proportion about 1.66 to 1. And so in the case of Lincoln Street and Newton Highlands, even at the VC3, you still got a proportion that was comfortable as a street space. And that's what that indication is with the red lines on the upper diagram.
Okay. I think I'll dig in with you later on that, because on Walnut Street, I think Walnut Street is narrower actually than Lincoln. The Lincoln I don't have as much of a problem with. And then one last question, if I might. How many communities are not following the state law?
Well, I guess that's a bit of an open question. I know there's a couple communities that have expressed opposition to wanting to follow it, but part of what's been happening in the last couple months is that the DHCD agency, with its new name, in partnership with the Attorney General, has been providing increasingly stringent clarifications about what is or isn't required. And the way I think we're trying to approach this is that rather than getting into a point where this becomes some complicated situation where the city of Newton starts to find itself pitting itself against the state, and that becomes a Boston Globe headline, and all of it just becomes a big fight about what is or isn't required, we're using this opportunity to do what's right for the city. And so as long as we can achieve compliance in a way that works for everyone and is good for the city, everyone hopefully wins. That's the way we're thinking about this problem.
Yeah, I'm not questioning Newton's compliance. I thought you made a really good point when you said all of these cities and towns are subject to this, so you're not going to see a rush into one city for building. And that's why I'm just wondering, are there many cities that aren't, and is the state doing anything about that?
I can give you two pieces of information about that. We, as a private company that's been helping both Newton and other communities, are working with now 6-ish other municipalities on this: Arlington, Milton, Winthrop, Lincoln, and we're going to do Cohasset and Norwell soon, and everyone's good with it. We are all pressing forward. Everyone has their own complications. Every inner core municipality that we know of is actively seeking compliance. I know of 1 or 2 across the 175, most of whom are fairly low density, that are talking about not complying, but I do not foresee a large groundswell of resistance to this rule.
Okay, great. I have more questions if nobody else has them, but
We have a few hands up now, but let me say, we have less than an hour tonight, and the planning department has said this before. They are open to your phone calls. If you have your own set of questions, you want to write them out or just make a phone call, come in, whatever, to help wrap your head around this, everybody's welcome to do that. Councillor Humphrey and then Gentile.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the staff and consultants for putting this presentation together. I think it's not a coincidence that the first 4 hands up were Finance Committee members, since we're all very interested in this, but usually busy when zoning and planning is meeting. I thought it was especially interesting, the aspects of the presentation that focused on the existing conditions and existing history of these village centers, which is also what Councillor Kalis initially asked about as well, because I think that it's important to remember the origins of these village centers. In many cases, or if not all cases, for the village centers that we're talking about, these were transit-oriented village centers that grew out of, rail lines and things like that in the pre-automobile era. And of course, when the automobile comes around and suddenly the need for being densely close to all of the places that you lived, worked, and went to was reduced, then it was no longer seen as necessarily cost effective or as good of a value for your money to be building vertically. But up until that point, it had been considered, and I think this shows how much of this comes down to policy choices and things like that, and societal choices that result from those, that the idea before then, up until that point, was that you would be gradually building more vertically, more density into these village centers so that everyone could easily walk, 10 minutes, 15 minutes to something. Maybe if they were a little better off or worked in agriculture, maybe they'd have access to a horse to go a little bit further. But in terms of a lot of people's day-to-day routines, they were still walking around places as late as the end of the 19th century for their sort of short routine trips around. And I think if you look at a lot of the other mill towns that were not, 18th century villages, but were built in the course of the 19th century and especially the late 19th century, they do have that kind of height as a default of 4 stories, even 6 stories, and these do look in scale when you're walking past them. They're not cavernous canyons. They're not towering over you. We saw the diagram a few minutes ago showing that generally we're talking about at least 70 feet from building to building across a normal street width. In many cases, we might even be talking about more, widening out those sidewalks and so forth to really make this an inviting place to walk around. But we're in a period that's shifting again. Not everybody's going to be able to walk all the time. Not everybody's going to be able to walk everywhere. We understand that. But it is legitimate for us to start thinking very seriously about how we, maintain an existing sense of place, maintain our history, but also get back to that earlier history of that walkability and that proximity to all the things that you need in your day-to-day to be able to go about your life and your work and everything. So that's what I'm approaching this process with. And I appreciate that the staff and everyone has been very open to hearing feedback on specific improvements. And I know I'll be talking with the staff later this week about a few specific points as well that I'm still not sure we've gotten quite right, but I think we're definitely getting close. And so I appreciate the approach that's been taken. I guess one quick question, then I'll leave it there. In these parking discussions, and this was brought up earlier, I understand the concept here, not having a parking minimum, letting the market determine it, but presumably in your calculations, you've got kind of an estimate of where the market is probably going to land in terms of parking per unit and things like that. Is there sort of a ballpark number there? I know it might vary on a case by case basis, but I was curious about that just because like you said, there is going to be parking associated with this new construction, just not the extent to which it's currently required. So I'm wondering if we can give people out there in the public a sense of roughly what we're expecting at this time.
I mean, when we've been testing different versions of the zoning on particular sites that we've identified, just to take the draft zoning out for a test drive, excuse the pun, we've been using one parking space per unit to test and do feasibility studies to figure out how to accommodate that one parking space per unit on the proposals, because that seems to be where the market is landing for residential development closer to the village center. So that's a number we've been using. The utilization of recent projects is a little bit lower than that. It's drifted down to about 0.75 or 0.8, but to be conservative, we've been doing our testing at 1 unit per acre. I mean, 1 unit per, 1 parking space per unit, sorry.
All right, thank you.
For now? Okay. Councillor Gentile, you're next, followed by Councillor Grossman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know that this has been asked and answered earlier in this process, but I just need a refresher. Can someone explain where the new projects that have recently been permitted or have already started, such as Northland, Riverside, the 40B project in West Newton Square, the project down on Riverdale, the proposed project that we're hearing about up on Route 9, where there's an organized effort against it. And I'm sure that there are others. How do those units factor into this requirement of, 8330?
So they don't. The 8330 is a total zoning capacity. So it does not count existing units. It doesn't count planned units. It only counts the maximum allowed by zoning. So for example, if you have a particular parcel where zoning allows for 20 units to be built maximum, and you get 10 units built, you count 20. If nothing gets built, you count 20. So we are only counting what the zoning allows for. Existing or proposed housing does not factor into that calculation at all. And some of those projects you mentioned are outside of our areas as well. They're, a little further from a T-stop, or were not included as part of the village center zoning.
Just one other clarification too. The zoning as proposed, that's on the table, sets as a threshold for as of right, an as of right process, a 30,000 square foot parcel, which is a little bit less than 3/4 of an acre. I think all of those projects you mentioned are on sites that are more than 30,000 square feet, which means we can't count them anyway because they would be a special permit process that would go through the same process that projects of that scale go through now.
So, for instance, Riverside, even though it's literally at a T-stop and there's over 500 units, not one of those units is going to count towards our requirement for over 8,000 units.
That's right. And so we looked at including Riverside in part of this. We looked at all of the T-stops. So we started this effort focused on the traditional commercial village centers, which Riverside at the time didn't fit into. And then once we got further into the requirements for MBTA communities, we looked at all of the T-stops to see where it made sense to focus. Riverside was one of them. Part of the issue is that we need to allow for the housing to be built as of right. There's very complex zoning at Riverside right now that was built through the city council, through the community, that we would not be able to include. Many of the mitigations that were required there, many of the requirements for commercial development, for off-site improvements, we wouldn't have been able to include. So for those reasons, we've focused on smaller areas where, like Tim said, it makes more sense to allow without a special permit. Those large sites, like Riverside, like Northland, should always require a special permit or some level of discretionary review.
Well, I think that we should all get prepared for Riverside 3, which I'm expecting is going to be proposed in the not too distant future, because Riverside 2 can't get the financing, even though it has over 500 units. So if I'm correct, then maybe we ought to think about making that area as of right to create even more housing units, because that's what I expect is going to be coming back in. So we should start to think about that a little bit. My second question is on the parking. I understand the rationale behind going easy on parking requirements, but I guess I don't understand the wisdom of going to the extreme of having absolutely no parking requirement. And I believe I just heard, because I don't know some people are going to have cars, and I don't understand where those cars are going to go other than into the areas surrounding the development, into the neighborhoods, which I think it would be everybody's fear if there isn't some parking required. So I believe I just heard someone from UTL say that they believe that where the need is going to shake out is 1 per unit or 0.8 per parking spaces per unit. Why not, instead of just saying a 0 requirement, why not just reduce it significantly to say, 0.5 parking requirement per unit, to at least provide some parking or a requirement for some parking?
Sure. So we did look at this. We started off by thinking about what should that parking requirement be. What we found is when government sets that regulation, it's often out of step with the market. So as we discussed, we haven't updated our zoning in decades. Those market conditions are constantly shifting. They vary by location, by type of housing. And this is one instance where our interests tend to be aligned with the developers. Parking is very expensive to build. However, you need to make sure that you can rent or sell those units. And that you can finance that housing. Banks tend to want to see some level of parking to make sure that people will live there. We found that the developers are better at understanding what that demand truly is and only building to what is needed in order to reduce costs, but make sure at the end of the day that they're still making a profit. So what we've seen in recent developments is it's been trending downward. So a project will come in and ask to reduce from 2 spaces per unit to 1.5. And then the next one's at 1.25. We've seen 1 even below 1. And then what we've seen from what actually gets used is it's always less than that. We did overnight counts in partnership with MAPC and found that half of the parking spaces in our multifamily developments, including recent ones that received parking waivers, is sitting empty. The actual utilization tends to be closer, as Tim said, to 0.7, 0.8. It varies on a number of conditions. So rather than us setting a number but always being a bit behind the curve on that, we think it's better policy, and this is the direction cities and towns across the country are moving as well. It's better policy to take out that requirement, ensure only what's needed gets built. And there may be some projects where they go below, where they go to 0.5 or below. You're reusing an old church and turning it into housing, and there's no existing place for parking, and you may have none because you're located right near the T. There may be other buildings where they think they need a little bit higher. There's a number of 3-bedroom units, so that ratio goes up a bit. So in this case, we really think the right policy is 0. In addition, it really helps us with our ability to comply with MBTA communities. The state's model is set up so that it really reduces the amount of housing that can be built when you require parking. It's using some of that surface area in the lot for parking spaces, and that's limiting the number of housing units that you can fit above it. So by not requiring it, but allowing for it, we get the benefit of that from MBTA communities, and we think it's the right policy direction.
Well, I would have liked to have heard from you, Teal, on that, but anyway, I have one last question I want to get in. And if I could hear from our consultants, because no disrespect, Jen, but we don't get a chance to hear from the consultants very often, especially those of us on finance. Whereas I can interact with staff anytime. So if I could hear from you, Teal, on this, or if they wanted to add anything on the parking, it just is logical to me. And it's illogical to have a 0 parking requirement. And we just heard from our consultants that they think that the need is going to shake out around 0.8 to 1. So why not at least have some net and safety net in there and require at least a half a parking space per unit? But I guess we can.
Councilor Gentile, Mr. Love is prepared to speak to this question also.
All right.
Yeah, I think a way to think about this is that, any development project or most require financing, bank financing, or financing through a process that requires fairly rigorous underwriting standards. And I think the underwriting for development is a better control on getting the parking ratio right than government. And so I'm both what I said is correct, that underwriters now require about 0.7 or 0.8 to finance a project. In Newton, they might change their mind later. They might say in 2 years that it's 1.2 or you can't get financing. And those underwriting standards tend to be fairly consistent through a market based on financing. So I guess our recommendation is let development underwriters set the limit, because they're not going to give financing to a project if the parking isn't meeting market expectations to solve it, and just keep government out of it. So I'm both reconfirming my 0.7, 0.8 ratio, but also saying that I think that, that maybe government should control that, because you might get a better matchup with the market relative to housing production.
All right, thank you. My final question is, we keep hearing about, this overwhelming need for housing, and yet the financial markets don't seem to understand that, because what I find puzzling is Riverside, with over 500 units, can't get financing. Northland, last I saw, has slowed down dramatically, which I'm going to assume has something to do with financing. And that has, what, 800 units. We have a hole in the ground on Washington Street, the Dunstan Street project, which is, a number of units. And that has stopped or slowed down because there are financing issues there. So can somebody from UTIL explain to me the disconnect? We have supposedly all this need for housing, and yet nobody seems to be able to get financing.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a supply problem because of supply chain issues, the rise in interest rates, and other national and global economic issues. Projects aren't penciling out right now, but the market will self-correct and housing will happen again, and so you zone for the medium and long game. So I think, there's up and downs every 7 years historically in the real estate market. We've had a longer run of good years, twice what economists had predicted, and I think that this is a classic 2-3 year downturn, and I think that there will always be demand for housing in Newton, especially if through the new zoning we can develop a wider range of unit sizes and unit types.
And yet nobody can get financing.
Yeah, right now, exactly.
All these much needed projects. I don't understand it, but anyway, thank you for at least trying to explain it.
Thank you, Councilor Gentile, Councilor Grossman, and then Oliver.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to my colleagues on the Zoning and Planning Committee and everybody and our city staff and consultants who I know have poured tremendous amounts of time into all this. I have a number of comments and then some questions, and I'll try to be brief because I see that our time is running out and other colleagues have questions as well. So my main comment I've made in small group conversations where I've had the opportunity to give input on this is about design, because to me, that makes a really big difference in how this feels. And in the slides that were up, one of the early slides looked to me like it came out of our old Washington Street vision plan, which was something I always thought was very well done and had a lot of really attractive sort of imagery and vision to it. And then there were later pictures in the slide presentation that struck me as less attractive. And I've been trying to figure out why this is not an area of strength for me in being able to envision what different zoning rules are going to look like in a built environment. Part of what I think I've reacted to is variation in design and heights. Taller buildings next to medium buildings, next to smaller buildings, next to another taller building. Some of it was about common spaces that looked really lovely and tasteful in the images. Lots of trees or green space the protected bike lane set aside from the street, different features that I've never gained comfort over the years are going to just materialize without government involvement. So I guess I'll leave it as a comment for now. Someone can sort of answer this question if they want, but essentially I am looking for more reassurance and more connecting the dots on how what we are looking at as a zoning code translate to design features that lead to really beautiful and desirable spaces and prevent against things looking like really just massive, tasteless.
So, Councillor Grossman, I think
yes.
Tim Love is poised to address your question. I think we get the point.
Okay.
May he speak?
Sure. I think there's two the two simple answers are that we've set the as of right zoning threshold at 30,000 square feet, which is a relatively small lot. And we've set the maximum building footprint at 15,000 square feet, which is about 4,000 or 5,000 square feet smaller than the 28 Austin Street project, for example. So what you can do as of right is already a smaller building than most of the new development that's happened in the village centers more recently. I think the other piece of it is that there are a set of design standards built into the zoning that encourage the addition of features like bays and porches and balconies that are incentivized because they're allowed to extend beyond that footprint. So we've really worked very hard to get the market to respond to the regulations in there. I think those things that you're responding to in the kind of freehand drawing that Zach had that came from that earlier study is that that's actually showing multiple buildings around a publicly owned space too, or projects like the Austin Street project that are more than 30,000, lots that are more than 30,000 square feet, where the negotiations through the special permits can include things like open spaces, those other kinds of amenities. That's why we set the threshold, because you get to a scale of project where site planning and site design becomes more important. So that's a lot of answers, but we can certainly follow up with you with more detail.
No, that would be great. And coupled with that, I would like to know how we are going to get things, and maybe the answer is we can't count on getting them, like a big green in a place like Newton Center, like a one parking garage structure, perhaps, if that is desirable or part of what answers the parking conundrum. But I will leave that for more discussion later, because I don't want to take up too much time. I think what I will say that goes with that to me is I am looking to connect the dots on different city policy and movement in other areas that supports what we're looking at and hearing here. And there are two key things that come to mind. One of them is about citywide parking policy. My colleagues and those who have been working in our Newton government for a long time certainly know that parking in general is a very hot topic constantly in the city. Councillor Gentile talked about the fear of pushing parking to the neighborhoods. We talk all the time about our overnight parking ban and our different parking policies and how these things go hand in hand. And while in general, I don't have a problem necessarily with the idea of doing away with parking minimums, what I do want to know is how are other parking policies in the city going to support that or not, because it strikes me as problematic to say we're going to have no parking requirements here, but yet these other I was going to use the word protections, but I know some people don't feel that way about it, so that's probably not the right word to use. Rules, how they couple together. The other thing is that, as many of you know, the school question about school capacity One of the struggles I'm having with it is I've seen the argument made multiple ways when it seems to serve different purposes. So, oh, sorry, I don't know if that was as loud in your ears as it was in mine. So I'm on the Ward Underwood Task Force right now. It's become very quickly a controversial topic, and talking about whether we still need 15 elementary schools going forward, et cetera. Over the years, one of the reasons the Ward School was bumped down the list was because other schools were in areas where we were expecting big developments. For example, Countryside was bumped up because of Northland and the expected influx of children that would result from that development. So what I'm trying to say is that there have been times I've heard, well, we need to do X with schools because we're expecting lots of children out of developments. And then in a process like this, where we're talking about a very large number of units, we're hearing the opposite argument. So putting all that together and how we're going to handle that as a city policy is also important to me. In terms of questions, in the future, I'd like to know more about the site plan review element and who would be conducting site plan review and what protections are in there. I want to know about Newton Corner on the slide where you were showing the numbers of potential units. There was no number next to Newton Corner, and I was presuming because a lot of that is already built out, but I don't know if that's actually true. And then I wanted at some point to look at the compliance slide because there were different numbers on there where I was looking at what we're required to do versus what this provides. And I'd like to dive into that further. I'm happy to do it now, but again, I'm recognizing it's 7:32 and we're supposed to start full council at 7:45. So I'm happy to stop there and pick those up on another occasion if that's more appropriate.
That's a long list of questions, so I'm going to suggest planning do some quick answers on some of the simpler ones. I would like to say that I think if you talk to Josh Morse and the administration and the Public Facilities Committee, we understand that Countryside and Franklin went first because of the horrific condition of the schools. But
Ward School was ranked as in the worst condition for the longest period of time. I mean,
okay, all right. I just
2013.
we're not seeing.
So I don't want to derail.
Yep, I know.
And go down a different road there, but I have some objections to some of those characterizations.
We should have more conversations, and I think maybe you want to have as chair of finance, you've never been able to come to a zoning and planning committee meeting, totally understandably. So perhaps we can have quick answers now to some easy things right now, and then you might want a separate meeting with the members of the department.
Sure, and we're happy to meet separately and spend more time on some of these things. Very quickly, we agree that there needs to be coordination citywide when thinking about public improvements and things like parking. We also believe the tools are in place to handle things if there is an issue, such as permit districts, et cetera. For schools, we're looking at more incremental growth. So for things like Northland, we were expecting 800 units to happen, sequentially within a number of years. Not so sure anymore. What we're proposing for this zoning is much smaller infill development. For example, there are 18 students living at Trio currently, and we're not allowing any buildings as large as Trio under this zoning. So we're expecting a few students here and there and spread across the city. And as we have done and will continue to do, we'll coordinate with the school department on that. We are happy to talk more about site plan review. We are proposing the planning board be the body for that. And what was the last one? Compliance. So one of the reasons you don't see Newton Corner, the number of units on that map, is because it's outside of our half-mile boundary from a commuter rail or Green Line station. So we're not actually able to count it towards the MBTA community's requirements, or at least we can't count more than a certain percentage. Right now, we're just showing capacity where we're within that half mile. And again, these numbers are maximum capacity, not at all what we would expect to be built.
Okay for now, Councillor Grossman?
Yes, I have lots more to say, but I
I'm
again
sure.
recognize that
This
that
isn't a
time
lot
is
of
limited.
time, and if council feels like it wants to have a special meeting just to talk among ourselves, we can do that too. Let's see how this goes. Councillor Maliki, and then I have in the room Councillors Oliver and Lipoff.
Thank you. Don't turn me on twice, mics. First of all, quick question. Since the retail priority black line blocks parcels aren't going to count towards MBTA zoning, why would we not have some sort of reasonable parking requirement in those? Why not subdivide, VC3 straight and VC3 MBTA? So you could distinguish.
Sure, it's partly about MBTA communities. If we do apply a parking requirement, we are looking at having to expand the area or allow taller, more dense buildings. But it's also about what's right for village centers. I think those areas that are those priority streets are exactly where we want to see limited parking, where we want the emphasis to be on designing for people and for less expensive housing rather than designing around vehicles.
Okay, that's your answer.
And just one thing to add to that, it's not about providing parking on private sites, right? We want to create opportunities for businesses. And we know that the requirement of a business to provide private parking, for itself is really challenging. So if we really want to incentivize small businesses on properties that never had parking in the first place, not requiring them to provide it is the way to do it. So I think, as Jen was saying, it's not just about our MBTA communities requirements, it's about what's best for our city. And not just in Newton, just ask any business owner or someone looking to open. The zoning requirements that they need to hit are very tough barriers. And so we want to remove those barriers to encourage new businesses to open up, and parking is a big one.
Okay, I guess I find a hard time seeing how the small businesses you're talking about would be able to afford rents in the new buildings that would be being built under this zoning.
It's in existing buildings too. So the no parking would apply to our current retail spaces as they turn over. We see this all the time where one business leaves and a landlord is trying to rent the space, but due to arbitrary requirements in the zoning, they have to provide X number of parking spaces, even though they've never had any. They're on older buildings in the core of village centers. And then that means a several month special permit process. You're paying a lease or holding that space open during that process. And then you can't add employees or add seats without coming back for additional parking waivers. So this helps not just businesses in new buildings, but businesses in existing buildings.
And for new buildings, if a development, if a business requires 4 parking spaces, let's say, and those are underground spaces, just because it's a tight lot and they build the spaces underground, that's $400,000 of construction costs. Who do you think is going to take on that cost? The business that's renting that space. If you don't have to provide those $400,000 of space, it's going to be a much lower rent.
Okay, it seems like you could still require, say, 1 parking space per unit on the residential units on top of the businesses and still exempt the businesses. But anyway, I have more questions. So I've been to enough of these meetings to hear Councillor Wright repeatedly ask for an estimate of the total units that could be built by right, not just in the village centers that would count toward the MBTA, but in all the village centers. And on top of that, the other priority street, priority retail lots, and so forth. So I think it's not enough to say that it's too difficult to calculate that, because that could our best estimate is that could it result in a 15,000 unit by right potential, not just the 10,000 that you estimate. So I would like to see kind of a sensitivity analysis, since you're overachieving the MBTA target already. What would happen? I know you did the sensitivity analysis on the parking, and you lost a lot of, unit count, unit potential. But I would like to see the numbers if you reduced VC3 down to 3.5 stories tops, how many units that would result, keeping everything else constant. I also think it's, Councilor Grossman mentioned the school capacity, and, everybody thinks, oh, things are slow, people aren't having kids, not so many kids in Trio, et cetera. But, I remember back when we closed a whole bunch of schools because we thought we wouldn't need them, and things change. That is not my area of expertise, neither is sewer capacity or water capacity. But I've been to many meetings recently talking about, trying to keep us from replacing and adding more artificial turf fields, and I'm told repeatedly that the reason that we have to have artificial turf, heat island, environmentally unfriendly, potentially carcinogenic turf fields, is that we can't possibly meet field capacity and demand for, recreation without them. So if we can't do it now with 32,000 or so units in the city, how are we going to meet, that's just one example, capacity for that service with a potential, easily 30% increase in population?
So let me just quickly, because I'm cognizant of the time, address the overall capacity. So it's as we talked about in the presentation, it's not a real number. It's not a useful number to calculate because it won't serve us in any way of giving us any reasonable idea of what's feasible for many reasons. It assumes everything gets wiped out, maximum housing units built with zero parking across the city. And we know that's not going to happen. I also just want to refocus on, there's a lot of emphasis on this number, and it's very important that we comply with state law. But the reason we started this process was about what's best for village centers. We need housing. We have limited options now for people to move, to downsize, to stay in Newton, to locate in Newton for the first time. People cannot afford the rising costs of single-family homes. We need to provide other options for housing, and that's what this is meant to do, is provide more housing at new price points, at different types and sizes of housing. Also, as far as lowering the height, we did a lot of economic analysis to set this zoning and to make sure it is feasible, because there's not much point in updating or changing our rules if we're not actually going to see anything that can get built. If we want to see really active ground floor uses and have vibrant village centers in the core of village centers, we do need that 4.5 stories. And again, it does get us the additional housing and additional affordable housing.
Okay, I'll stop here so somebody else can ask questions.
Thank you. And I just communicated a little bit with our president, who says we don't have to start our council meeting exactly at 7:45. We have several people wanting to speak. Do you want to go another 15 minutes? Okay. Councillor Oliver, and then Lipoff.
Great, thank you. Excuse me. This first question I had is almost embarrassing.
Could you speak into your mic a little more?
Oh, I'm sorry. Am I on? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Earlier on in the presentation, you gave us a little bit of a lexicon there, footprint, right, as one of the criteria, and then you started to talk about floor plate. Are they interchangeable?
They're the same thing, yes. Okay. Sorry about floor plate. Floor plate's more of a technical term.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. And I think I know the answer to the second question, but one of the first slides we looked at described the criteria for VC 1, 2, 3, and MRT. And then a few slides later, we saw the possibility of additional floors. Those additional floors are not in that first chart, right? They would be in addition to that first chart?
That's
that
correct.
right?
That's correct. And the one additional story, again, is only allowed in VC2 and VC3, and that's at 25% affordability. The 2 additional stories is only VC3 in certain locations where it's not adjacent to residential, not adjacent to MRT. So there are some limitations in where that can be used.
Right. Thank you for that. And then there have been a couple of questions here that I find really interesting because, you know, there are a number of people here who have said, you know, the 8330 and the 10,000 units and then the 10,000 plus units. And I look at those maps and the numbers, and they get pretty big pretty fast. And then tonight, someone used the term, you know, we don't believe that any of this is going to be an undue burden on the city. And then I hear us saying, well, it's really hard to calculate. But we kind of have to calculate it. Like, we need to know. So my question is, how do those things make sense together? Because what I'm hearing is we haven't calculated it, so we're not really sure in its entirety if it is going to be an undue burden on the city.
I can explain how for other municipalities, assumptions were made to get to some kind of estimate.
Sure.
And there's a couple of tiers. First of all, I think, again, to reiterate, those total numbers are if every property owner decided to sell their property and every person that bought that property decided to tear down the existing structure and build to maximum zoning without any parking. What we've done in the past is we've looked at like a 25-year horizon and we've made estimates that let's assume, and these assumptions in a way are a kind of art, let's assume that 20% of the properties turn over in the next 25 years. And let's then look at those particular properties. Let's actually pick them. And then let's actually figure out at an aggressive parking ratio by doing a little bit feasibility study, what if those 20% of those parcels aim for a 0.5 parking ratio? How many units are we talking about then? That would be through a set of assumptions we could all agree is a realistic aggressive build out of the new zoning, but that would be a lot of work to do all that work. And so, but those are double assumptions. The double assumptions are propensity for redevelopment as putting a finger up. It's like the current zoning. How many units have been built under the current zoning, you know, as a percentage of what's possible? It's as if it's saying under the current zoning, what if everything changed and met the current zoning? So I don't know if that helps or not, but it's a cantilever of assumptions that would require arguing about each step of the decision tree.
And I think, and I may be having a hard time articulating the question because I'm not questioning how we got to the 10,000 or any other number for that matter. What I'm questioning is and if I recall, there's a spreadsheet that the state provided, and you plug some numbers in and there are formulas and magic happens and numbers come out the other side. We know what that is. We know how to use that. I actually think I just saw it on someone's computer right here. And if we can do that and get to 10,000 for the areas, right, that are within the VCOD, why aren't we doing the same thing elsewhere? That's, I guess, my question, because it's not so much how we get there, because that's given to us. And agree with it or not, we have to do the estimation based on the state's law or the state law. So my question is not how do we get there or why or how accurate or, right, because I have a lot of respect for the guesswork that goes into it or the educated guesswork that goes into it. I'm just curious, we're going to be asked in a relatively short period of time, if we agree with this or not. And I'm really struggling with, well, what is it? Because it's not 10,000 units. It's significantly more based on the guesstimates that we're providing, or asked, or we have to provide.
I would say, as the person who spent a lot of time looking at the spreadsheet, I have two main observations which I think come out of this. The first is I think it's not 10,000 units, it's significantly less, as strange as that feels. The way the state came up with the magic that you're talking about, that's behind the spreadsheet, it's not even, it's actually not magic. It's reasonable estimates for kind of what could happen, kind of. It's not GIS, it's not using architecture, it's not thinking about the sides or the fronts or the backs or setbacks, it's not thinking about underground parking, it's not thinking about building code, it's a couple very rough percentages of spreadsheets. It's an appropriate tool for the state to think about that broad problem, which is sort of how I was talking about it from a legislative perspective. That across 175 municipalities, all the municipalities are taking a step to build housing, and they've come up with these crazy numbers as just a way to apply it apples to apples for everyone. All the rules in zoning, or maybe another way to think about it is, all the rules in zoning right now, which cause housing not to be built, aren't just whether or not it's a special permit. It's not as simple as there are developers waiting with projects in the wings ready to build, and there's just this special permit rule that's holding it all back. It's all the other stuff. We're changing one lever and a couple rules about height to make it a little bit more possible. In many ways, that funny thing is the reason why, and I promise it's not urban planners being evasive about trying to answer your question, but I promise that's not what it is. It's that we're talking about something at a totally different scale. The idea of how many units are going to get built is a question about development, right? It's actually the way that Newton and many municipalities have development happen, one by one by one. How many is this building going to be? How many is this building going to be? But I think at no point, except for if you talk to like modernists in the post-war period and controlled planned at no point has a city ever said, we will reach a target of X people, and in 50 years, and we're going to have a perfect plan for every single school that's going to be built over the next, in a funny way, that is an impossible question to answer. So our job is to do what we do know how to do. We'll think about height. We'll think about what a reasonable building is. It will be incremental. And as these things start to happen, whether it's schools or infrastructure or parks or whatever else, it'll be the job of city government in 30 or 50 years to tackle these pieces as we go. But we want to have all the perfect answers. And I think it's impossible because we're trying to predict 2 generations from now what it's going to be like. We shouldn't have the hubris to say what we won't be able to figure out. And so we're going to find out what we can, and we're going to make sure it's okay. And that's the best we can do for you.
I'd love to add to that. Could Util please tell me if I understand this correctly? Because in our zoning and planning committee meetings, this has been a subject that has been repeated many times. What we understand Lexington did, which is way smaller than Newton, was to satisfy the MBTA community's formula and then go parcel by parcel. They're much smaller. They could do this parcel by parcel to see, okay, what's physically possible on this site. You know, some sites, actually, they might be zoned for one thing, but you actually physically can't build that thing there. For example, we have really small lots in our village centers. You couldn't put underground parking under them. There wouldn't be enough room to maneuver the parking. So maybe they'll never get developed because they would want the parking. How do we go through our city parcel by parcel, I guess is the question. We've never done that for our existing zoning. We just know we're not at full build out from sort of broad analyses. And then, so what's the good of that number is what we've talked about in the committee. I don't know if that helps anymore.
Well, I think it would be a lot of work, and I don't know what the value would be, but I think it might be interesting, this would be much easier to do, is on the exact same parcels that we're proposing in the new zoning, just run the numbers on the number of units that could be built under the existing zoning, and it's going to be a big number too. And then what we're convinced about is that the building size and shapes across all 4 colors that we have are going to be nice and contextual with our built-in design standards, that you'll get buildings across the kind of feathered tiers that we're talking about that are the right scale and feather down nicely to the R districts. So from a design standpoint, I'm confident about our zoning, and in a way that test fit would be more of an urban design test than it would be a unit test, because even if we tested them all, that would be, again, what if every single property switched out and became a new building? I think it might be interesting for the city to, but that's a GIS thing because it's FAR based. It's just run what's possible today, and it's going to be a big number too, and then you'll say, well, we should change our zoning, and the good news is you are, so.
Sorry, it'll be low because you can't allow anything. So it could conceivably be high. This is where the rules get crazy. It might be high if you said everyone got a special permit. But right now, as of right, the number's 0. It's 0. Yeah, or for multifamily.
So what I'm actually hearing is kind of, because I think I've asked this question at least one other time. If you can take and put a number on, and maybe that's actually the wrong word I should be using. Why don't you take the same approach you did for the areas that you have created numbers? And even if you believe that they're irrelevant, I don't. I do not think they're irrelevant at all. And give me a number for Newton Corner and another one for Nonantum. Use the same formula. That's all I'm after. All I'm hearing is the number's irrelevant, we don't need it, it's going to be big. And all I want you to hear from me is, yeah, but it's kind of important to some of us on this side of the conversation. I want to know what we're thinking could be done here, even if all of the numbers that are on this map that get to the 10,000, if we believe that they're inflated by some number, some amount that is unknown, and I really do appreciate that. I am curious, like there's been a lot of effort put into this work, and I'm still struggling with well, what could we end up with here? Like what are we thinking? And that's where I'm coming from. So far, I haven't heard one argument anywhere from anyone that changes my question. And nor have I heard an answer, other than that's really hard and it's going to be too high. But they're all going to be hard and they're all too high. So let's have it all. Thank you.
I think we've covered where we are with this anyway, and I'm sure there'll be more discussion on it. Not now, though. Councilor Lipoff is next on the list, and I did want to favor off-committee councilors. I know Councilor Wright has had her hand up, but I do know that we have to get into council, and I don't think there won't be time for the whole committee to speak tonight. So, so Councilor Lipoff and then Lucas.
It's 7:59. Should we just call it quits right now and start our meeting? We have the two from the committee don't need, with all due respect, don't need to speak, and we should.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to go till 8, but never mind.
Okay. Well, it's 8 o'clock. It's 8 o'clock.
It is 8.
Well, then I'm not going to. I really don't have any questions because I'm kind of a member of the committee, showing up almost.
You
all
have
the time.
been there most every meeting.
So I think there's just quickly 2 things. Number one, everybody needs to thank everybody on the Zoning and Planning Committee who has put in so much time planning, util. Everybody's been incredible. This is a huge undertaking. I think as counselors who aren't on top of this as much, this was very helpful. I think the number one thing that we need to get across to the constituency, because I hear it all the time and it's wrong, is that we can't take these 10,000 units. We've heard 3 different ways, Councillor Oliver, an explanation, and we'll keep talking about it if you want. I get it. I get it that this is a number, and thank God for the MBTA communities, because they laid over what we've been trying to do, an effort that's going to help us get to our finish line. That's how I see this mandate. It's forcing us to deal with this. And I understand that there's a disconnect, and we need to tell everybody that number, and when you say that number isn't a real number, you get this blank stare like we're pulling something over on them. This is going to, we're never going to build 8,000 units. We're going to build more. It's going to take 100 years, and we don't know each decade what this city is going to look like. So to ask what fully built out looks like, to ask about our schools, all of that stuff is irrelevant. Now, when I say that, people lose their minds like I don't care. So this is the kind of conversations that we have to have with this city to ease their pain. On land use, I have learned over time the fear is so much greater than the outcome. I see people who voted against Austin Street who are sitting there having meetings with their constituents, loving the coffee shop and saying this wasn't that bad. The fear is always worse. We have to embrace this process and have a little bit of an open mind on this. And we keep working on it. We'll get to the finish line. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Lipoff. So I know everybody wants to get going, but I did have Councilor Lucas. One question. Make it quick, please.
Yeah, you took up my time. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll try my absolute best to be brief. So this is the planning, but as you know, there is an ongoing effort to repeal the overnight parking ban, and I don't know if they're going to collect enough signatures to get it on the ballot. That's a conversation for another day, but I think we have to plan for the fact that it could be overturned. And we are in the village center zoning, there are, it's on the table to eliminate all parking requirements. Don't necessarily agree with it, but I understand the logic behind it, just like the logic behind repealing the overnight parking ban. But I was looking at the Washington Street Vision Plan, and there's a section that says develop and implement a public parking garage strategy. Just wondering how those efforts are going. It says develop and implement a public parking garage strategy. I have it right in front of me.
I think that gets at the issue of parking management. I don't think there's any proposals right now for parking garages that I'm aware of, but there are quite a few conversations about parking management, parking pricing. Deputy Director Kyra brought up the issue of resident parking. We're in close conversation with DPW about a number of fixes for parking and ways to address issues that arise. So that's kind of a constant that we're addressing.
Okay, but the question was, how is the public parking garage strategy going? How is that effort?
Yeah. So
is it ongoing? Was there one?
Not that I'm aware of. No,
Okay.
I don't think we're in favor of a parking garage strategy per se. I think we want to use the existing resources that we have, and we want to implement measures which affect parking demand, and how that's dealt with, but not with garages.
All right, well, it's in the vision plan, and it's part of the comprehensive plan, so I would like to, we're probably not going to get one based upon your answer, but it is there in writing. So I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you. I think folks are eager to go to our full council meeting, so apologies to Councilor Wright and the committee and the planning board, who I see one member just put her hand up, but I think we have to bring this further questions to the department directly, to our meetings in July, and of course, we have our public hearing next week, so I hope everyone will be able to attend. In person is great if you can do it. Members of the public will be both in person and online. Yes, and Councillor Krinsman, have you been listening? Is there a motion to hold? Oh, not hearing him at the moment.
Of course, there's a motion to hold.
There you go. All those in favor on the committee, please say aye.
Aye.
For both items, and we are adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.